Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'm feeling a little bit more positive today than I was last week, not because of defence lifting its performance, there are plenty more disasters to discuss, but because I had a lot of very positive listener feedback to my comments about the ridiculous levels of secrecy that surround defence projects in this country and how debilitating it is. For a while I thought I was just, a bit of a lone voice in the wilderness, but I can assure people that going by the nature of the responses, this must be of great concern to many out there. Anyway, I'll have a bit more to say about that. Now, last week, and this helps illustrate the point, the Deputy Commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, who's Lieutenant General Steven Sklenka, from the Marine Corps, was at the National Press Club. You can look at it on iView if you wish. I recommend that you do. Now, he seemed like a good bloke, as far as one can tell, and he adopted the position of answering all questions from journalists, including me, rather than following this new Australian military tradition of running and hiding from the media. Now, the day before that, or maybe it was a couple of days before that, there was a briefing at the US Embassy for Australian journalists by two State Department officials on ITAR changes and harmonising Australian and UK laws supposedly to allow freer trade in military stuff. So again, that's just an illustration, a lot of engagement from the US. We're seeing a bit from the UK, from Australia, nothing, which I find bizarre. Anyway, on ITAR, changes, I've always been a bit wary about these sorts of things. We have a small industrial base that doesn't seem to be growing. That's my impression. I haven't seen any recent metrics. And as far as I can tell, AUKUS is all about expanding the US industrial base, not Australia's. Now, part of this sort of legal and legislative process that Australia is now obliged to follow to line up with the US are new secrecy laws, which are fairly ghastly in that they impose a lot of additional process for ex-ADF personnel and also departmental staff. I mentioned this in passing last week. Anyway, don't take my word for it. I'm going to quote Innes Willox, the head of the peak industry body, the Australian Industry Group. Many of us know Innes, and he is not known for being either radical or alarmist, and this is what he has to say. A new law to prevent the sharing of sensitive military information that came into force this week is causing confusion among former defence personnel who face a maximum 20 years imprisonment for breaching the Act, while the Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Act, or SAMS Act, aims to protect our national security. The Act in practice is illogical, unfair and unworkable. The impact of this unguided missile of an act, I like that phraseology, on the defence industry, former defence personnel, including veterans, and to Australia's trade position and international reputation is deeply concerning. Innes continues, from this week, one of the offences under the Act means that former defence personnel, including former ADF, civilians working in defence, and full-time reservists, will need to apply for a foreign work authorisation if they will be performing any work for a foreign military, government, or an organisation, even those unrelated to any military purpose, where the foreign government has control, whether formal or informal. Offences under the Act do not need to have a connection with military secrets, and because working with a foreign government body is defined so broadly, the legislation could easily work in absurd ways. We're getting towards the end of the quote. For example, if an administrative officer works in the Department of Defence, that person will need a foreign work authorisation for at least a year after they depart Defence if they want to work for one of the thousands of companies located in Australia with some foreign government influence, or ownership. This is the case even if the person did not have access to military secrets, and also if the company is a civilian entity with no connection to national security. Bizarrely, this offence under the Act does not apply to other high-level clearance holders, including intelligence agencies, other government departments, ministerial staff, or defence contractors and consultants. So, the administrative officer with a low-level clearance will need a foreign work authorization, but intelligence officers will not, nor will consultants who hold a top-secret clearance. The SAMS Act will make it manifestly harder for thousands of defence personnel and veterans to move into new roles after they leave their employment in the Defence Department or the ADF. Just completely ridiculous. In the last episode, I discussed problems with recruiting, and I would suggest that things like this stupid act is just going to make that every little bit more difficult, and the chances of growing the number of uniformed people by the stated target of an extra 20,000 by the year 2040 under current conditions is just not going to happen. But getting back to General Sklenka, he had a few nice lines. It's good for a laugh. He's a great presenter. When he was asked about Australian sailors being inadvertently involved in a war, in the case that our people happened to be on a US submarine at a time when war was declared, and he said the US does not kidnap Australian sailors. Now, that's true in a literal sense, but the plan is for up to 400 Australian sailors to be embedded in the crews of US submarines, presumably the Virginia-class ones, since that's the ones that we're meant to be getting. However, the obvious scenario to discuss is what happens if war suddenly breaks out. The subs are not all going to return to port to offload the Australians. So, will they come to the surface and put the Australians in a lifeboat and point them in the direction of dry land? Well, no, of course not. And by the way, I think this is a regular issue because there are always cross-postings on a variety of platforms that US personnel are on Australian ships, we're on US ones and UK ones and other countries involved as well. And I've always assumed that in the thankfully, unlikely event that you suddenly go to war, that's probably just too bad for anyone who comes from non-belligerent nations. They presumably just do their job until such time as they can safely get off the platform. And I have a vague recollection that something like this happened in the Falklands War, with that crisis developing very rapidly, just a few weeks. The story that came out not long after the fighting was over was that the Royal Navy had a tradition going back to the 1930s that all of the onboard laundry was done by people of Chinese background from Hong Kong. That's not a joke. You can Google it if you wish. For the last 100 years, that's been standard Royal Navy practice. I mean, how colonial, how typically British to believe that Chinese people are inherently better at washing, ironing, and folding uniforms than anyone else is. Anyway, it turned out that on ships such as the aircraft carrier Invincible, a number of Chinese laundry workers turned out to be inadvertent participants in the Falklands War because they couldn't be replaced in time. Well, that practice actually has now just been phased out because of, have a guess, a random guess, anyone? What would be the problem with Chinese people on British warships? Security. Yes. There you have it, because presumably they might find some written top-secret orders in the captain's dirty trousers and then commandeer the ship's communication suite to transmit the plans to the Bureau of Public Security headquarters in Beijing. Now, a few words on nuclear-powered submarines, since I report on various failures of process and a variety of stumbling blocks which we're never told about by Australians. There are a couple of developments. Last week, Congress added a Virginia-class submarine back into the 2025 financial year, taking the number back up to 2 per year, and that seemed necessary to have any hope of reaching the 2.33 per year target later this decade that will allow submarines to be sold to Australia. And I also have to apologise to the Australian Submarine Agency, because I've bagged them out previously saying they do not answer questions at all. Well, they do. I sent in a couple of questions and I've received answers. I'm going to share those with you. Question 1, how was the figure of US $3 billion calculated as Australia's contribution to the US submarine industrial base? Is it a percentage of the Virginia-class budget or something like that? The answer supplied, Australia's contribution of US $3 billion into the United States submarine industrial base was agreed between the parties to represent a fair and proportionate contribution. It recognises the requirement to expand the US submarine industrial base alongside the overall investment by the US government. Well, there you have it. Pretty much a non-answer on that one, no detail at all. Second question was, secondly, for the sale to occur, a US president has to, in quotes, legally certify that the sale will not degrade the capabilities of the USN. What does legally certify look like in practice? The answer to that is, this question should be directed to the United States government. Well, wouldn't you have thought our own people should know what legally certified means in practice? Anyway, 2 non-answers, but better than nothing, I suppose. Now to the occasional segment, Hotel Kingston Friday lunchtime rumours. And this one now comes from a very good source, and that is that a project to fit Australian armoured vehicles with active protection systems will no longer go ahead. That's because of budget limits, so thank you, AUKUS, once again for blocking additional protection being added. Active protection systems are things that degrade or destroy incoming threats, such as crude RPG warheads or more complex, more capable anti-tank guided weapons. And they include things such as reactive armour, very popular in Eastern Europe and Israel, not so much in the West. Explosive reactive armour is where a steel tile gets blasted into the path of a shaped charge, sort of disrupting its flow, or other things such as Israeli systems, one called Trophy and another called Iron Fist. And these are highly automated because of the need for extremely quick reaction times. They use a radar to detect a threat and then basically fire a shotgun-like blast at it. Now, these things are very effective against fast-moving threats because the tracking algorithms screen out smaller, slower-moving targets. And think about that for a moment. This is because otherwise armoured vehicles would be constantly firing shotgun blasts at passing birds. Because of that particular aspect of them, they are not useful against things such as these FPV drones being used in Ukraine, but they are very effective against the higher speed weapons I mentioned earlier. In fact, the US Army will fit Trophy onto all of their Abrams main battle tanks, probably about 2,000 of them, but not Australia. Budget cutbacks, none for us. Again, as I say, thank you, AUKUS, for that. Well, thank you, AUKUS, and thank you also the government not lifting defence spending to the level that it needs to be so that we can go ahead with all of these things. Now, speaking of weapons, and since I've just mentioned Ukraine, I've seen well-placed press reporting from Ukraine saying that they are no longer using GMLRS rockets from their HIMARS systems because of Russian jamming. These, of course, are the 20-year-old rockets that Australia will start manufacturing next year. I'll have a lot more to say on this topic in a future podcast. And what else? The General Purpose Frigate GOAT rodeo continues. There's still no sign of the promised request for information or Australian market survey or whatever the thing is called, and no indication of when it will be released. One of my colleagues mentioned, and I can't source this, that they had information from the UK that a Royal Australian Navy officer had said at a forum in the UK that the RFI might be issued by the end of this year. Now, if that's correct, and I have no reason to doubt it. As I say, it comes from a good source. One, once again, has to wonder what on earth can possibly be going on. I've already related this, if it were not so serious, comical mistake of the independent review into the surface fleet not understanding that by nominating Korea's FFX Batch 2 and Batch 3 ships, they have asked not for one Korean design, they have asked for two. Even that hasn't been clarified. Now, look, as I think I've said before, and I hope it's the case, I don't consider myself to be at all a nasty or vindictive person, but if I were the Defence Minister, I would call in the senior members of the review team, Admiral Hilarides, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and I would point out that error and say, how is this possible? With all of the consulting fees that you've received and all of the support staff you have, how come you can't even get basic facts right about which designs are on the shortlist? And if they didn't have an extremely good excuse, and I'm talking like a seriously good excuse, not the, a dog ate my breakfast thing, unless they could come up with something really credible, I'd say because of the nature of the error that you have made and the chaos that you have caused and the further delays to a project that is already considered to be very urgent, I suggest that you hand back your fees, because otherwise we're going to come after you. And by the way, all of these plum consulting contracts that you keep on getting from our suckers in the Department of Defence, well, you've just had your last one because clearly you are demonstrating a considerable level of incompetence in just not being able to get your basic facts right. Anyway, that's just me. Now, also, what else has happened in the last few days? Oh, yes, the retirement of a third Huon-class mine hunter. That's been announced, and that'll go with the retirement of the first Anzac, HMAS Anzac, which was formally decommissioned about a week ago. I touched on this before because C-1905 has been cancelled because of funding issues caused by AUKUS. That means that Australia's entire mine countermeasures capability rests on 3 aging, unupgraded hulls, which is completely inadequate for a country of Australia's size and with so many ports that need protection. Now, with a couple of minutes to go, I'm just going to circle back to the topic of secrecy and, well, idiotic levels of secrecy in this country and ask, does Australia have military secrets that need protecting? And the answer is yes, we do have some. I can think of a few where we would want to keep the performance details very tightly held, but nothing like what is justified by the current behaviour, or the behaviour for the last decade and getting worse, of senior defence people and bureaucrats are just cowering in absolute terror. And it comes down to trust. The United States trusts their people to speak with journalists. Same for the UK, same for Sweden, same even for South Korea, even Japan. They trust their people. Clearly, in Australia, we have a climate of profound distrust. Clearly, ministers don't trust senior military people to be able to say something publicly, and senior military people don't trust juniors to speak directly with the media. Now, if the United States, with all of the things that they have, hardware and systems and a nuclear arsenal, and they're manufacturing so much leading-edge stuff, their concerns about Chinese espionage are not sufficiently great as to stop military people briefing the media. So why can't ours do the same thing? Okay, that's it for today. As always, thank you for listening, and goodbye for now. See you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.